My name is Bárbara Marcondes. I am the policy assistant at Inclusion Europe, and I'm also coordinating the My Talents for Diversity project. So today we're having the second of a series of 6 events on employment. These events are under the My Talents for Diversity project, which is a project funded by the European Union's Right, Equality and Citizenship program. And the aim of this project is to increase the participation and inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities in the open labor market. This project is being conducted since 2019, and it is with partnership with Plena Inclusión in Spain, Antwerp Management School here in Belgium, and FBIT in Estonia. So today's event is about the existing EU legal and policy instruments to foster the employment of people with intellectual disabilities. And to talk about this topic, we invited Timothy Ghilain, who is a Senior Policy Officer of the European Association of Service Providers for Persons with Disabilities, EASPD, Mark Bell, who is Head of School of Law of Trinity College, Dublin, and Anouk von Hoofstadt, who is Senior Researcher at Antwerp Management School, which is also our partner in this project. So before, I would like to ask the participants to mute yourselves. And on one accessibility note, so if you click on the 3 dots, you can activate live captioning for this event. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite Timothy to start speaking. Thank you so much.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm trying to share the screen so that you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Barbara, for inviting me to speak at today's event. It's always very important to discuss this item and very good to share with the group. And I was very interested to look into the outputs of your project. As Barbara mentioned, I'm Tim Ghilain, working at EASPD, an association in Brussels that is promoting quality services for persons with disabilities that support and empowers them to become active citizens based on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I was asked to make a presentation on the EU policies on the employment for persons with intellectual disabilities, and it's a very, I would say, very complex thing, because employment is one aspect, but there are so many things that touch on it and that have to be taken into account if we want to have a success to bring the person with disabilities in the open labour market. If we set the scene, we see that there's a huge proportion of persons with disabilities that lack access to proper employment. We unfortunately lack proper data. We rely on Eurostat, that does only so often. The most reliable data we have data from 2011, but there we see that people with disabilities have 20% below average employment. We have to add to that all the people that are inactive or they are out of the statistics, considered not able to work, for example, in Austria. And if we look at the current crisis, which is a health crisis, but also an economic and employment crisis, it's always the most vulnerable that are affected first, and so persons with disabilities. There is no doubt that employment of persons with disabilities is a major concern at the moment. So why invest in employment at all? There are many measures that can support persons with disabilities. There are institutions, there are sheltered workshops. However you look at it, it makes sense to invest in the employment of persons with disabilities. If you look at economic reasons, it's a good investment because it means that society doesn't have to pay for them. So it's protection from poverty. It has a better reintegration rate, and it avoids people staying long-term in unemployment. If you look at the social and human rights reason, it is the individual's right, as stated by the Human Rights Convention, as stated by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It is a clear right of every individual to have access to work. And it allows a better cohesion in society. It allows the person to be active and to be represented in society. And then there's the personal reason for the individual, where if you meet someone, one of the main questions you ask is, so what do you do? What's your job? It's a part of everyone's identity, your own job, and how you can develop and achieve success goes often through your career. And so giving the opportunity to everyone to join employment is crucial. I mentioned the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 27 clearly states that there's a right to employment, and that means not only employment, but employment for everyone on the open labor market with reasonable accommodation and with a real salary. That means not a token job and not job that will receive minimum under the minimum wage, but a job where they can have also a career prospect, when they can get involved, and which leads them to a path of rehabilitation. In that regard, the adoption and of the UNCRPD and the EU signing that convention has had a huge impact in the EU and for all the member states. We have seen a shift from the medical perspective toward the biosocial and then the human rights approach, with a focus now on community-based support and care, where the whole society's perspective and all the services perspective had to change and to shift from a more of a caring for the individual and helping and protecting the individual to supporting and allowing the individual to take his own decisions and to live his own life and empowering that individual. That meant an individual approach and much more flexibility depending on the individual's desires, wishes, dreams, and not what society thought he was able to do. If we look at the main barriers to inclusive employment, we have to, and that will also lead to which policies we need to address. We have a look on not disabilities, but abilities. So it's changing the paradigm on how we look at employment. We have the education system. A lot of persons with disabilities are going to VT or to special schools and receive lower education, which then doesn't allow them to go to university or better jobs, or they sidetrack them into very specific roads of employment. If we want persons with disabilities to reach the open labor market, education has to be also revisited. Accessibility of every item in society, but first and foremost, public transport. If you want a person to reach employment, if you want simply for them to be able to go to work, they have to be able to reach the employment offices. And too often, the public transport is not accessible or available for persons with disabilities, or it's too complicated. For physical disabilities, for example, with a wheelchair, they are not able to drive, and so they need accommodations to reach their jobs. But for some persons with intellectual disabilities, even though they could drive or they could use the bus, they need some support in learning the way to their offices. We're looking at the recruitment procedures, the assessments, the working method and environment, simply the office, the table, the size. The lack of holistic support is clear at all levels, but that's why you can't have one policy on employment of persons with disabilities that will be enough. You can't say, like we will have a directive on non-discrimination, equal employment opportunities. It won't solve everything, because we need to reform the whole structure around employment to be able to have persons with disabilities in the open labor market. For services that EASPD represents, that means also that we have to shift the support. So we need not only support in placing the persons in the employment, so giving them a training, then placing them, and that's it. We need to have support all through the life cycle and all through the work life. So training, placing, supporting the recruitment, but then the retention. We need also to support from transition from school to employment, from traineeship to full-time employment, or from different phases within the employment. These transitions periods are the most difficult for everyone, and for persons with disabilities too, and support need to be available. And in that regard, the model that has been developed of supported employment and other variables is support also for employers. And again, the environment around the strict employee-employer relation dynamic. It's important to make sure that the environment in which the person with disabilities goes is adapted. So it's not just finding a job, it's making sure the environment is ready to welcome and to make it sustainable. In that regard, answering the fears of the employers, supporting the colleagues in understanding the disability, supporting the family to understand and reassure them that it is possible and not dangerous to join the open labour market, are all part of services that should be delivered depending on the needs of the individual. So here we need to really the shift of the service delivery has to go through all phases of the individual's life and mainstreaming throughout the activity. So again, housing, employment, education, it needs to be mainstream and to have a cross-sectorial approach. So for example, we promote a file manager that will deal with all these elements, and so that the individual doesn't have to go to the social assistant for housing, to the specific services for support services or for their specific needs, and to the public employment agency for employment, but to have a file manager that would have knowledge of all these issues and be the contact point for all these people. So for specifically employment, it was in the past train the person, retrain them for a new job, finally find a place, and then stop the support. What we have seen is it needed to have placement first, and then give the training that is appropriate to that specific job. And that can be technical, so how to use this program, this computer program, but it can also be social, so how to interact with the team. It can be very technical, how to reach employment, the place of the offices, and it can also be training for the employer and the colleagues on how to interact with the person with disability. The like we can maintain the person in employment on the long term. So if you look at European overarching policies that try to achieve all that, there are several. First, we have the very broad European Disability Strategy, which was from 2010 to 2020, and is now being renewed into a European Disability Agenda. If you are involved in this topic of disability, I invite you to participate in the ongoing consultation discussions that are taking place. And the Commission is developing this very important broad strategy that will define how disability is perceived and implemented in all European legislation in the coming 10 years. This, however, is not directly applicable to European or national law.
Timothy, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. There was a question who briefly before you talked about cross-sectorial, and someone is asking if you could clarify exactly what that means. I think it's in the previous.
Cross-sectorial means not limited to the employment sector. So if we look at, if you want to have a successful employment policy for persons with disabilities, it should include the sector of social inclusion, of education, of employment, potentially of housing. And that means also at ministry level, effective employment policy should be in consultation between the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Employment, the Ministry of Education, sometimes the Health Ministry, things like that.
So it's this broad, more holistic perspective.
It's bringing all the relevant people at the table. In some countries, employment of persons with disabilities in the employment sector, in others in the social affairs. And so it means they have different perspective and understanding, while it cannot be a complete holistic policy. The policy has to take into account the different perspectives and bring everyone at the table.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
So yeah, the European Disability Strategy is an overarching agenda, an overarching objectives of the European Union on what they want to achieve through the legislative initiatives that they will develop throughout the years. Another broad policy is the European Pillar of Social Rights that you should hopefully have heard about, which covers 20 principles on what the EU want to achieve in the social field. If you look at Principle 3, equal opportunities. Principle 4, active support to employment. Principle 5, secure and adaptable employment. Principle 10, healthy, safe and well-adapted work environment. Principle 17, inclusion of people with disabilities. There are a lot of tools in this very broad pillar that can directly support persons with disabilities. And the way this pillar works is, again, it's not directly applicable, but every new piece of legislation developed by the European Commission, the European Union, should take it into account and try to implement it. That means that it's a tool for civil society, member states, the Commission to promote these items. And so we'll see later also the fact that there's so much emphasis on employment and employment for persons with disabilities is very positive for our sector. The European semester is a less known aspect, but is very important for the implementation of the pillar. In particular, with the new financial framework, the semester will be implementing these principles. So the European semester is a yearly structured dialogue between the Commission on one hand and the member states. So the Commission analyzes the trends and challenges in every country, develops recommendations for each country, where they have to make the country makes a report on how they addressed these issues, and so on and so forth every year. It's very important to include the issues that we believe are relevant in these recommendations or in the report of the Commission, because then the countries have to make a report on it, have to explain what they have done to answer these challenges. So, for example, in the past, EASPD, together with other European NGOs, have been successful in convincing the European Commission that employment for persons with disabilities was a major economic priority. So we could include more recommendations and more national reports covering employment of persons with disabilities. And in turn, national governments had to explain what they have done to improve this situation. In the future, that European semester will become even more relevant because they have expressed the ambition to link the semester with the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights, as well as others policies. But that means that the principles we have just seen of active support to employment, well-adapted work environment, inclusion of persons with disabilities, can be implemented with specific priorities in the European semester, and the funding of the European funding, so the European Social Fund, the European Regional Development Fund, Invest EU, and others will be linked to the priorities identified in the semester. Is there a question? And the discussion is part of the new multi-annual financial framework. So it's a new budget. So sorry for all the technical terms, but in short, this is the budget of the EU for the next 7 years. So it's a very long period where all the new funding streams will be reallocated. So European Social Fund becomes European Social Fund Plus. Erasmus Plus becomes Erasmus Normal. But aside from these technicalities, there are also structural changes. For example, as I mentioned, now the funding will be much more linked to how the semester reports will be formulated. And so all these items that are being discussed at the moment at EU level have a very important impact on supporting social services and social infrastructure in every member state. The European Social Fund, has been crucial in countries, for example, like Spain or Bulgaria, in helping to boost employment of persons with disabilities, while the regional development fund is important to develop the social infrastructure, the physical buildings, and supporting re-aménagement to develop reasonable accommodations. So this again is a discussion that is currently taking place at EU level, between the Council, Commission, and Parliament, to assess where the fund will be allocated. Aside from these very broad EU policies, there are also more specific European legislations and policies. So the first one, the main one, would be the Employment Equality Directive, which forbids discrimination based on age, disability, sexual orientation, and to take appropriate measures to enable persons with disabilities to join employment. So it's a very central piece of legislation. As a directive, it also is the highest level of European legislation possible, the most impactful, as opposed to council recommendation or communications. However, as mentioned, it is very specific to employment and doesn't cover the whole environment that pertain to employment. So, for example, there's European public procurement rules, which are very important in that it regulates how public authorities contract care and employment services across Europe. That means that whether it will determine whether the public authorities include elements like quality of services, community-based services, employment of persons with disabilities requirements in the public contracts. So it can have a really huge impact both on employing persons with disabilities directly through public contracts and on how the services for persons with disabilities and how to support them in the community are designed. So if you want to find out more, EASPD also developed a study on this. But we are then in constant communication to have better support from the EU to ensure persons with disabilities are employed through public contracts. Likewise, the EU state aid rules regulate how public authority can provide state aid to companies who employ persons with disabilities. Again, that is a very important topic, because if you look at competition rules, normally companies cannot receive support from state aid, except certain specific conditions. With those EU state aid rules, it can have an impact on how many people with disabilities have to be employed to receive the state aid, the amount of state aid, the administrative burden. And so these rules also that are not directly on employment for persons with disabilities have a very important impact. On EU labour law, you have the EU social dialogue between employers and trade unions, and again, these decisions that are not directive recommendation at EU level, nor are they national legislation, but they do have a huge impact on the employment of persons with disabilities. And it's crucial that social partners are also present or have an impact on these areas. Working time directive is a legislation that set up, for example, night time and working during the night, the remuneration due when you're working during the night or overtime or things like that, which is very important to protect the workers. But we also have seen that it means, for example, for small services that need to provide care during the night or all day long or at unusual hours, it becomes more expensive. And so they can have less people, which means less quality care. So it is a difficult and challenging directive between the quality of life of the workers and the quality of life of the users, persons with disabilities and others, and the services they can receive. And if we look at the work-life balance directive, there it's so focusing on, for example, maternity and paternity leave, focusing on all the relations between the care at home and work. In this regard, for example, for families that have to support individuals with disabilities, it's a very important piece of legislation that allow them to better take care of the individuals and better support them and empower them. It's also very relevant for persons with intellectual disabilities to be able to develop themselves and find the employment that is most adapted to their needs. So we have seen that when it comes to policies at European level, employment is not a key competence of the EU. So they have a main directive, but where we can make the most impact is by touching on the whole environment. So by touching on education, housing, transport, social life, working time directive, the social dialogue. It's through all these items, all these elements that we can try to have a better holistic environment to facilitate the employment of persons with disabilities. And there's still a lot of work to do, of course. There are some very positive progression that we've seen with mostly the pillar of social rights and its implementation through the European semester and ongoing dialogues with the Commission. It's also very inspiring that the new President of the Commission, Ms. von der Leyen, also has a more of a social background than previously and has been open to discussing these aspects. I will also mention briefly that there are also a lot of good practices on the inclusion of persons with disabilities. So if you're interested, you can contact me to find out more. But we've seen throughout Europe that, and in many different ways, it can be through support employment, like for example in Austria, but it can be a very specific implementation. For example, in Turkey, it's a dairy company that has developed a very specific program to support persons with autism in their workforce. In Barcelona, in Spain, it's the public authority that has decided to make a special connection with 10 organizations in Barcelona to support specifically the employment of persons with disabilities. So there are many good practices, sometimes very local, sometimes broader aspects that can be very inspiring. If you have any question, I'll be happy to answer later on. You can also contact me on my mail that you can see here. The PowerPoint will be available with the organizer, so you can feel free to share it. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much, Timothy, and thank you so much for giving this great overview of the policy and the funds at the EU level. I think it was very interesting and really stretching the importance of having this more broad perspective, not only focusing on employment, but also education. And so thank you so much. Now I'd like to invite Professor Mark Bell to give his presentation.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'll share my presentation. So can I? Can you see the slides now?
Yes.
That's great. Okay, so yeah, so I think really picking up on our first presentation this afternoon, I wanted to explore reasonable accommodation and the role that it can play in fostering the employment of people with intellectual disabilities. And I'm going to look at 4 issues within that. What is reasonable accommodation? how that can assist people with intellectual disabilities, reasonable accommodation and EU law, and then also some of the limits to reasonable accommodation. So just to begin by clarifying what we mean by reasonable accommodation, and I think the most straightforward way to explain that is to describe it as practical measures that can help to remove or mitigate barriers that people encounter to participating in employment. Typically, the organisation of work has been on the assumption that everyone has the same range of abilities, and there's a lot of taken for granted practices within the workplace, and these can create barriers to people participating in work. In relation to disability, when we speak of barriers, perhaps people are most likely to immediately think about physical barriers that can be encountered, and the need for adjustments to be made to physical premises, for example, to make them accessible for wheelchair users. But the idea behind reasonable accommodation goes much more broadly than that. And I've put an image up here of a guide that the International Labour Organization produced a couple of years ago, looking at the role that workplace adjustments can play for people with a range of backgrounds, whether it's disability diversity or ethnic and religious diversity. Although reasonable accommodation is certainly a good practice, it's also important for us to be aware that from a legal perspective, it's also an obligation. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was groundbreaking in specifying that denial of reasonable accommodation is a form of disability discrimination. And that is something that quite recently, the Court of Justice of the European Union has also acknowledged as well. And the convention has been ratified by the EU and by all of the 27 member states, so it's binding upon them. So what about the possible role for reasonable accommodation for people with intellectual disabilities? I mean, some research indicates that employers sometimes find it harder to imagine what kinds of accommodations or adjustments would be made to facilitate the employment of people with intellectual disabilities, that employers may find it easier to think about changes that they need to make to the physical workplace rather than other types of changes that can remove barriers. And that also perhaps reflects the fact that, as has been mentioned already, that in many member states, the participation rates of people with intellectual disabilities in the open labour market remains rather low. There's some research from Canada which found that actually people with intellectual disabilities, a higher proportion of them reported the need for accommodations amongst people with all types of disabilities, and that in terms of the types of accommodation that they reported, human supports were mentioned more frequently. So what kinds of supports could those be? Well, it could be, some, obviously in a sense, the adjustments that need to be made have to be tailored to the individual. Each person with an intellectual disability has their own personal combination of skills and competences. So the measures that they need will reflect their own circumstances. But some of the possibilities are, for example, some people might take longer to learn how to perform a new task. So additional training and support from the employer, perhaps in the form of a job coach, can help people to settle into a new job. It may be that a person can do, many of the tasks associated with a job, but there might be particular tasks that are particularly difficult. And so one type of accommodation could be to adjust the distribution of tasks, to remove a task. I'm going to mention a court case from the US a little bit later, but the background in that case was this was a woman with an intellectual disability who had been hired to work in a supermarket. And the evidence was that she was able to stock the shelves, to tidy the products, but she wasn't able to operate the cash register. And when she was first employed, that task was allocated to other staff. And so she was able to work effectively doing a different range of tasks. Another type of adjustment can be about information in the workplace and making sure that workplace documents are available, policies, training, and so on are available in easy read format. In the United States, there's a great range of resources on the website of the Jobs Accommodation Network, which has a whole section devoted to accommodation of intellectual impairment, with lots of really useful examples and practical guidance for employers. So that can be quite helpful to look at. Having a look then at the role that EU law can play in this area, well, it's already been mentioned that EU law has the Employment Equality Directive from 2000, which prohibits discrimination on grounds of disability. And within that directive, we find the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation for persons with disability. So this is a duty on all employers in the European Union, and indeed it's found in the national laws of every EU member state, albeit sometimes in slightly different ways. I've given you the definition that's found in Article 5 of the directive. This can be divided into two essential stages or steps. So first of all, it's about identifying what measures can be taken to remove the barriers that are making it difficult for the person to participate in employment. So what changes might be made? Some of those that we've just been talking about. And then the second stage is, would making that change impose a disproportionate burden on the employer? So, and this raises questions around costs, for example, but it's important that the directive clarifies that in the assessment of costs and whether those are disproportionate or not, you need to take into account the availability of public finance to support the employer. And in many states, there are schemes that will provide financial support to help employers recruit people with intellectual disabilities in different forms. So we've seen a number of cases over time before the Court of Justice on the interpretation of this provision. Probably the leading case remains the case of Ring and Skubo Verga. I'll apologise if there are any Danish participants. I'm sure I've mispronounced that. But this concerned two women who were experiencing back and neck impairments. They were both office workers, but their impairments prevented them from continuing to work full-time at a static desk. But the evidence was also that they would have been able to continue working at in a part-time capacity and using a desk where the height of the desk could be adjusted. And the court confirmed that reasonable accommodation is not limited to physical changes to the workplace, but it can also extend to the reorganisation of the way that work is performed. So, for example, allowing somebody to move from full-time to part-time work. In essence, the job is to be adapted to the worker rather than the worker having to simply accept the job as it already is. And I think this is also quite a useful example in the context of people with intellectual disabilities. Some of the research data would indicate that people with intellectual disabilities are more likely to be working part-time than full-time. So this can be relevant to consider there. So reasonable accommodation, I think, certainly has great potential to try to open up the labour market further and to make it more inclusive. But I think we also have to acknowledge some of the limitations. So reasonable accommodation is an individualised accommodation, as I've mentioned, and the law describes it as where needed in a particular case. So typically, reasonable accommodation begins with the individual requesting an adjustment from their employer or potential employer. So it's often initiated by the individual. And within organisations, there will often be workplace procedures to request an accommodation. Some people with intellectual disabilities may need advocacy support to assist them in representing themselves within such processes. It's important also to think about the employer's procedures for providing accommodations. Sometimes these procedures can be quite lengthy and complex, and are they accessible for a worker with an intellectual disability? At the same time, the law also has been interpreted as meaning that where an employer knows of a person's disability, then they can be expected in some circumstances to anticipate the need for accommodation. So it's not purely a responsibility on the individual to initiate this process. Often in practice, people with intellectual disabilities find employment in the open labour market through the assistance of other organisations, through supported employment programmes. So usually, I think it's reasonable to say that often their disability and their need for accommodation will be evident at the outset. A second issue that has arisen with the law is the fact that although there's a duty to provide reasonable accommodation, this is qualified by the need for the individual to be able to perform the essential functions of the post. Now, it has to be said that we have very few examples of litigation on reasonable accommodation by people with intellectual disabilities in Europe. It's very hard to find cases. And indeed, in general, there are very few court cases brought about employment discrimination by people with intellectual disabilities. There has been slightly more litigation in the United States, and that gives us an insight into some of the issues that may arise. And the following case, I think, is kind of a good example of that. So this was the case that I already mentioned, where a woman had been working successfully in a supermarket, performing certain tasks, and then at a later point in time, she was dismissed. When she sought to challenge her dismissal, her employer's argument was that the definition of her job role included operating the cash register, and because she wasn't able to do that, then she didn't meet the essential functions of the role. Now, in that particular case, the court looked at the reality of the situation. She had been working successfully for some time, doing other functions within the store. And the court said, well, it wasn't evident that actually operating the cash register was one of the essential functions of her job. But nevertheless, I mean, that and other cases have indicated that, there will be times where, the employer will define the job role, and it may be that if certain functions are defined as essential, that can create barriers that even reasonable accommodation may not avoid. Evidence of also some of the case law from the United States shows us that difficulties can arise later on, that sometimes employers will reorganize or new technology comes in, and that those can be difficult transitions for people with intellectual disabilities. And it may be that the essential functions change over time. So that's a feature to take into account when we think about the role that reasonable accommodation can play. So I think overall, reasonable accommodation has great potential, and it's I think largely unfulfilled potential in respect of people with intellectual disabilities when we see the very low rates of participation in the open labour market that are there, and better awareness of the types of accommodations that could be relevant to opening the labour market to people with intellectual disabilities could help. And in that regard, I've just put up an image there of a guide to reasonable accommodation that was published very recently by the European Commission, and it includes some interesting examples of accommodations for people with intellectual disabilities. So although I think it's very useful and we need to go further here, we also have to recognise that in itself it may not provide all of the answers, and we need complementary measures such as those that have already been talked about today. I think you're possibly on mute.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation and for really pointing it out that reasonable accommodation is not only about physical barriers, but it's much broader than that, right? And that I think sometimes there is a lot of this feeling that reasonable accommodation is something that is very expensive, but you mentioned it, that it doesn't need to be expensive. And to also stress that there is financial aid from governments to help employers to provide reasonable accommodations. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to ask, oh, I'm sorry, I think there is a question.
Yeah.
So you said about this spontaneous obligation by the employers, and how does this marry with GDPR?
Yeah. So I guess a common scenario in relation to people with intellectual disabilities is that they will be supported with a third organisation to find employment. And so in that case, it's very likely that from the outset of the relationship, the employer knows about the disability. And so in a sense, the employer ought to be aware of the need for accommodation and alert to that. Obviously, GDPR is relevant in the sense that, you know, there is no obligation on an employee to disclose a disability to an employer. And that can be a difficult issue insofar as if the employer says that, well, they didn't know that the person had a disability, then the obligation to provide accommodation may not arise. But in circumstances where the employer ought to know or certainly has been made aware, then it's clear that the employer may need to be proactive in providing accommodations.
Thank you so much. I think there are some other comments, but we can take that after Anouk's presentation. So please, Anouk.
Yes, thank you very much, Barbara, and hello, good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted to be able to tell you a little bit more about the study we did for the project My Talents for Diversity, a European study we did with Antwerp Management School on the employment of people with intellectual disabilities in the regular economy. So it's just a small part of the large group of people with disabilities, but it's important to, I think, focus on that group as well. It's studying on the employment possibilities for people with intellectual disabilities. It's something we have been doing at Antwerp Management School since 2015 now. So we've done it on very small scale and Belgian national scale and now European. For some reason, I cannot control my PowerPoint, so I will have to ask Ghilain or Barbara to change the slides, so we'll go back and forth a little bit. So, but if you want, we can start now. What I wanted to tell you is that the study has been completed before all this pandemic crisis started. So the results have to be seen in that before way and not after. Obviously, things have become far more complicated now in terms of employment of people with intellectual disabilities. But the techniques to give them an advantage or make it more favorable are certainly still there and will be there even after that. So, okay. So if you are okay, Barbara, we can start.
Yes, we are settling it now.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
If there is some sort of issue to suck it up, maybe you can go on.
Okay, okay, so we are trying to fix it. Perhaps if you can start without the presentation and then we catch up on. Okay, now it worked.
Okay, there we are. Fine. Great. So you can already go to the next slide, Milan. Okay, so as you can see, we decided with the complete project to try and find the answers on 3 questions. So what are the benefits of diversity management with workers with intellectual disabilities? How to ensure companies support workers with ID? And how do people with ID contribute to diversity management? Since this is a webinar on policy, I would like to point out immediately that even if we use the term diversity, we think this is a large concept which is commonly known in companies in regular economy and rather well applied, but we found it absolutely no guarantee for inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disability, we found in this and previous studies that it is still the last diversity issue to be taken into consideration after gender and race and culture and ethnicity and physical disability and so on and so on. I will get to this later on, but I needed to tell this now already, and I think some of you already made a comment on that. So what have we done? Please go to the next slide. So we applied a mixed methodology with a study on literature on this topic, an online survey conducted in 9 different languages and destined to companies and organizations who are already employing people with ID. So they are already inclusive. We got 204 responses, obviously, because there are not many inclusive companies and organizations, but they came, and that's the good news, 44 of them came from privately held companies. And I think the responses came from 16 different European countries, which is good as well. So we have a full view on what is going on in the whole of Europe. Next to that, we did 14 in-depth interviews with managers and employees with ID and with their colleagues or mentors or co-workers or whatever. 10 of these interviews were done in inclusive companies, so who are already employing people with ID, and we did them in 6 European countries and in 10 different types of businesses. So there too we have quite a large view on what is going on in Europe. Next slide, please. Okay, so within our team, we have a researcher with intellectual disabilities. This is him. This is Thibaut Bastien, and we absolutely wanted him and we needed him to have his vision on an opinion on the work of people with ID, on employment, etc. He really made us richer and the study richer. He was a real added value, apart from that he's a really nice person to work with. So he executed the interviews with us. He analyzed the results of the online survey with us, and this all went very well. What you need to know about Thibaut and that this is coming back to what the previous two men said, Tim and the professor, on how we go with those people, and how education is organized. Thibault was educated at the lowest level of special education in Belgium. He was destined to pass the rest of his life in daycare centers, at school. Apart from one teacher, everybody was convinced that he was not capable of doing whatever job. Not in the regular economy, not in shelter workshops, nothing. As far as the education system was concerned, he was going to spend the rest of his life, you know, just being busy with little things. And it's only thanks to his own ambition and determination and the support of his wonderful parents that he managed to get jobs and prove everyone wrong and do what he has done for us for the study. It was really fantastic. So we can go on to the next slide, and we can go into detail of what we've done. The first question was, what are the benefits of diversity management for people with intellectual disabilities, of course, in the regular economy? And if we go on to the next slide, we can see that most of the time, employment of a person with ID can only be successful when tasks are being adapted. Tim already said it, the professor already said it. There is an absolute need for job design and job crafting if we want an employment of a person with ID to be successful. And throughout the survey, we discovered that 85% of our respondents said they agreed in adjusting the range of tasks to the competences of the employee with ID. And during the interviews as well, several managers testified that when adapting operations and communication for the person with ID, they found out that it had a favorable effect on all other workers, and they concluded they should have done it earlier and before for the complete staff, even without the person with ID being present. So it's really refreshing, and it has a refreshing effect on all the process and the systems and the old habits that we may have grown into and that need to be, you know, revised. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that in most of the cases, employment of people with ID is an act of social engagement. And okay, it improves the workplace. You see our team, that's our team, Thibault in the middle, and the girl on the right side, and the boy seated next right to Thibault. Those are his two buddies, and the man in costume is our professor. It's the vice dean of Antwerp Management School. So you see from the photo that we get along really fine, and yeah, we love to work with them. It was really a very good experience, and of course it wasn't always this funny, but it's really so that in most for 58% of our respondents, social and societal engagement are the main reasons for inclusion of a person with ID in the company. And for 42% of them, the reason for hiring is the clear and shared inclusive company culture. That was the fact for us as well. But again, we absolutely needed Thibault for his insight and his way of really looking at what is going on in the world. So it should not come as a surprise that 78% of the respondents of the survey said that they expected a positive effect on the employment of a person with ID on the organizational culture. And in 82% of the cases, respondents even said that employees are well integrated in the staff. That grows on them and that grows on the company. During several of the in-depth interviews, managers saw changes among their staff when they hired a person with ID. For example, having a colleague with Down syndrome around made the other workers put their own sometimes small problems really into perspective, and everybody grew more collegiate, and there was more solidarity. And another witness testified that the hiring of a group of people with idea of a sheltered workshop made their employees fear for their job. They really thought they would be, you know, let go. They needed really clear communication and reassurance when it came to, yeah, their job was safe on several occasions, but in time, they all realized that thanks to the coming of the group of shelter workshop, their department had actually been saved from closing down. And so now there are really, the group of the sheltered workshop has become, colleagues like all the rest of them, and everybody's well integrated, and it's good. So it's really inspiring to see what goes on when a person with ID comes into the company. I see that there's. Do you think that the conversations with are staring? I'm looking at the question of Adrian. That's a difficult one. I'm not sure what you mean by the conversations workplaces are starting, I guess, to have around. Maybe, Adrian, if you can explain yourself a little bit, I really want to come back to that afterwards. So I'll go on with the next slide. Okay, Milan, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so enforcement is another benefit of having employment of people with ID. As I just told you, they really can make a difference. Thibault made a difference for us, that's obvious. And in the previous example, there was this department that was saved from closing down. They can also help, and that joins what Tim and the professor said, they can also help in taking tasks away from other people, tasks that may be weighing on staff and are maybe the reason of heavy turnover. So taking them away and assembling those tasks into a job for a person with idea can really be beneficial for everyone. Of course, this requires changes in recruitment, in selection, and we need to look at competences and skills and talents rather than school degrees and diplomas. And we really need to adapt ways of applying for jobs. Our own researcher with IDEA has difficulties in reading and writing. So applying online with boxes to fill or writing motivation letters and CVs are a real obstacle to him, and he will always need help for that. But on the contrary, he's very social, he talks well, and for him, you know, the way to apply for a job could be with a little video where he can talk to people, where we can see him, and this could be a good way for him to, you know, show his added value and his skills. So that's really, changes and adaptations are really key in this, not only for employers, but also for recruitment agencies, for the education system, for schools, in preparing people to get, you know, ready for the job market. Can we have the next slide, please? So, yeah, the results of the interviews and survey among these companies are who are already employing people with ID are quite positive. But we need to ensure that a growing number of companies employ and support workers with ID. I told you we only had 204 respondents because we absolutely wanted companies and organizations who are already employing people with ID, and there's just not a lot of them. So how to ensure it, and we will find the answers in the next slides, in the next 3 slides. There is definitely a huge lack of knowledge and expertise. When you ask people what intellectual disability is, most people cannot give a definition, and they come up really quickly with the disabilities who can be named, such as autism or Down syndrome. And based on that limited knowledge, they think people with ID are just not capable of working in the regular economy. They see far more difficulties than there really are for a number of these people. We have met with HR managers and company physicians even, who talked about pathologies, diseases, as if ID is something that can be cured. This is the really medical approach, and as a professor and Tim before said, we've grown into more social approaches, but it's still there, and that is the reason why a lot of managers, a lot of HR managers still think that we cannot hire these people. We have met with company recruiters who said that they were an inclusive company because some of them, and this came as a shock to me, because some of them, the staff, talk to the gardeners of the subcontractor outside of the office building. So far, diversity and inclusion. Okay, others said that they only needed high-level profiles in their company, forgetting that they also employ cleaners and kitchen staff, etc., etc. So there is a kind of a tunnel vision when you start talking about employing people with ID, just because people don't know about it. So as I said before, a diversity policy is not enough, because people with ID will always be the last in line to be hired after other minority groups, and this won't be, this will get worse in these pandemic crisis times. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide, and we need to adapt the recruitment techniques. That's one of the support we need to have. We need it for our researcher with ID, for example, applying for a job, as I said, with a video in which he can prove his talents can work. We see that this is already being done in the UK. Schools and recruitment agencies get together and make this work through a video for their pupils, their students, or for the HR managers, which is really good news. I think companies need to inform recruiters that they can propose what could be considered as deviant profiles. We interviewed a retailer who works like this, and it proves him right. He has a very diverse and loyal workforce, but he needs to continue insisting on this approach with his recruitment agencies. Time after time, he needs to tell them that he wants to give a chance to everybody. And so he has an enormous diverse workforce, but it's going really great, and they're really loyal. Next to that, companies and people with ID need to be coached and trained to be able to start working together. In our survey, 60% of the respondents, all inclusive companies, I underline this, said that they had gotten formal support for the employment, and that this was sufficient. So we need to keep on providing this, and maybe even better coach and train and support employers. At Antwerp Management School, our own case in a way, we hired 2 researchers with an idea for a previous study, and that went well. It was a really good experience, but we did learn how to tackle some of the problems, and we could apply this knowledge on the hiring of Thibault, and it's certainly made things a lot smoother this time round. So training and coaching policy has to be put in place and has to evolve. We have to learn from it. Okay, labor policy has to change as well. somebody, I don't know if it was a professor or Tim, said that we need to be aware of the fact that people with ID maybe cannot work full time, and I fully agree with that. Sometimes it's too stressful and too strenuous for them. So if in a country the labor law stipulates that we can't get a labor contract without a minimum of like 16 hours, and we have a job as a company for somebody who works 10 hours, we cannot hire him. And that's something we need flexible with. We came across an example like that. A company wanted to hire somebody with ID for 9 to 10 hours a week, and they really wanted to give that to a person with ID, and that was not possible because of the labor law in that country. And so they didn't hire him, and they went along with a subcontractor, which is really a pity because it was there. So we can move on to the next slide, please, and look at the compensation that there's given, the financial support that is existing in many countries across Europe. I can tell you that saving money by hiring a person with ID and getting financial support for it is not sustainable. In only 20% of the cases, respondents said that they hired a person with ID for economic reasons. So on the other way, financial support may not be seen as a way of getting low-cost personnel, low-cost staff. However, a financial support policy is absolutely necessary to compensate the lower rentability and the support of staff or external experts, because that is a reality as well. But this has to be made easy. Most policies in Europe are far too complicated, and this results in the fact that employers do not even start to search for them, or do not hire a person with ID, or better hire without financial support. I'll go to Karin de Baats. I see, isn't autism considered as cognitive disability and, for example, intellectual Down syndrome? Yes, okay, I agree partly on that, Karin. We can have complex disabilities, multidisciplinary disabilities. So autism can go along with intellectual disabilities. So learning problems and the fact that they went to special education can go into the fact that people with autism become workers with intellectual disabilities. Okay. Let's go on to the financial support. Most of the financial support is decreasing over time to stop completely at some point. And the problem is that the disability is not going away. So there too, we might need that policies adapt and get more flexible and more sustainable in that way. Let's have a look at the allowances people with ID are getting. We've seen that in several countries that when people with ID go to work, they don't get any allowances anymore. And it's very difficult when they lose their job or they want to stop working to get this allowance back, which we have to avoid at all times, of course. So the result is that they start to negotiate just a limited number of hours with their potential employer, not to lose their allowance, or they start working not being paid at all. So, okay, people who criticize the system could say that, well, you know, they get an allowance, so they are paid in a way, and you know, they can work for free. Of course, that's not what we want to do, and we don't see this as real inclusion. So there as well, we might need to look into the flexibility of the allowances and the allowance policies, and adapt when they get a job. Maybe they have less allowance, but they can return to the full allowance once they don't have a job anymore, because obviously there's turnover for them as well. So this is also something we have to look into for the future. So having said that, we arrive to the third question, which is on the next slide. How do people with ID contribute to diversity management? And we can go immediately to the slide, the next slide, slide 14. I will go over this rather quickly, thank you, because a lot of it has been said by the previous speakers and already by me. It's obvious that workers with ID are very loyal, they are very proud workers, they are perfect ambassadors. Our researcher is as well. He's very, very proud to be a researcher for a university. So it's an excellent ambassador. And others, we've seen that others are too. And they have a beneficial effect on processes. We've said that as well, because they come in with another vision and they add value. So change might be easier with them around. And of course, tolerance goes up with the rest of the workforce. So I'm nearly done. We can go to the recommendations I wanted to share with you. I think we can go not to the next, but the slide 16. We have created this GROW model for inclusive employment. And I could resume this this way. There's an absolute need of partnerships between schools and the industry. It's only that way, in only that way, they will find each other. So employers can discover the potential and the talent and the skills of people with idea, and people with idea can discover the regular economy through internships and adapt to that, and without having strings attached for both parties. From this, there will be job opportunities. Once employers see their added value, they will be willing to create job opportunities. So schools need to adapt to this inclusive world, to creating a training and a coaching that might get them into the regular economy. And they too have to focus on the skills and not on the disabilities. When I come back with our example with Thibaut, the school just focused on the fact that he's bad in reading and writing, that he's got a lot of problems with that, but he's very social. He's orally, he has no problems. He can analyze, he can be pragmatic. So but nobody saw it, and that's a real problem. We also believe in the creation of a network of inclusive companies and entrepreneurs to, you know, exchange among peers, to find workers with intellectual disabilities, because that's still a problem, and to grow awareness on talents and skills of people with intellectual disabilities. We absolutely need better accompaniment for people with intellectual disabilities in creating CVs, in applying for jobs, and connected with potential employers. There too lies a role for the education, but there too there's a role for agencies, for recruiting agencies, etc. People with intellectual disabilities have real difficulties in finding their way on the job market. They most of the time have a lack of network, and that's important to them. So there too, a number, in fact, all their entourage has to work on that problem. To be honest, we found, Thibaut, in our own network, because I am personally engaged in Special Olympics, and Thibaut is a top sailor. He's a double gold medalist at the World Games, and that's how I knew who he is and how we could be of added value for our study. So we need to empower people, for example, through the creation of easy-to-read documents needed to onboard, to apply, to have new employees starting with the agreement, for instance. And so they need to understand their job, but also everything that goes with it, and then be given leadership to make changes, to make adjustments, but also to talk about their jobs. And I think employers as well as employees need to become ambassadors, need to become advocates. And I know that for employers, there's a privacy issue. They are very reluctant to talk about their inclusive employment. And that's on the opposite of the fact that most workers with IDEA love to talk about it. So we need to balance that. We need to be take into account the GDPR, but to find a way to talk about it. I think that's absolutely necessary. So a lot can be done on a European level, but a lot will have to be done on a local level because of the different laws in countries and even on regional basis. So I think it has to be tackled on different levels. Well, that's it. I could go on for hours. I hope you have enjoyed this insight. And if you want more info, please contact me. You can also find the full report on the Inclusion Europe website. I don't know if I can have time to tackle some of the questions. Barbara, Milan?
Yes, I'm going to start the Q&A right now. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Anouk. And as you said, the European research is available in Inclusion Europe's website, and I really invite you to take a look at it, especially because it has a lot of testimonies taken from the interviews that were done, so it's extremely interesting. And soon also this research is going to be available in other languages, several other languages, so keep an eye on our website so you can have the research. Okay, so now I'm going to address some questions and comments that were made. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. So the first one was, I think perhaps also taking on what Anouk pointed out about knowledge and expertise. So there is a question from someone that works in the Council of the EU in Diversity and Inclusion, and you're asking, we are looking for best practices on reasonable accommodation in the form of personal assistant, and you're asking who would be able to provide. Milan already mentioned in the comment EU, the European Network on Independent Living, but please also feel free to give other suggestions if you would like. So addressing to the other questions, perhaps this one, Adrian, that started the conversation, started the question and reformulated. So what you're asking is basically that there is in this context that there is a lot of conversation around recruitment people with intellectual disabilities, and this is being framed around the concept of neurodiversity, which is more close to the social model of disability, and where people are seeing intellectual disabilities as differences where the workplaces needs to accommodate. So if also any of the speakers would like to comment on that.
Well, I can comment on that, saying that, of course, the workplace needs to accommodate, but that goes for a lot of people. That goes too for other people with disabilities, physical disabilities, social disabilities, for people. So the problem is that it's seen as too difficult very often because they think they really cannot do anything, and they have in mind the severe cases. And this is something they need to, well, in a way, discover when having somebody with ID around. The problem is, I think we should start with, somebody said we should look at the talents and the skills, and I'm absolutely agreeing with that. We need to look at the talents and skills, and do we need that in our company, and then create a job for that, and do it, and not seeing limitations. obviously, for our own researcher, we did not need to do that much adaptations. He had me next to him as a colleague. If I wasn't there, and if our vice dean, who is a supervisor of this project, wasn't available, he had two buddies for him. And that's about everything he needed. He's very sad. Computers, he has a smartwatch and he talks into it, so he's very autonomous, much more than even I knew before working with him. So it's just, you know, do it.
Yes, thank you so much, Anouk. Professor Barr, Mark, or Timothy, would you like to comment? Or I think you're muted, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. I think just one observation, some research done elsewhere within my own university on intellectual disability within Ireland showed up that the prevalence of autism was considerably higher amongst people with intellectual disabilities than within the population as a whole. So on the one hand, it's true that you know, we're talking about different things when we're talking about neurodiversity or intellectual disability, and it's important to clarify that, because often employers and organizations which are unfamiliar with these topics can conflate a lot of different things. But sometimes it's also, I suppose, valuable to be aware of you know, multiple disabilities, and that individuals may be experiencing more than one type of disability at the same time. And I suppose, just as has been emphasized, you know, I suppose when we're looking at how to remove barriers and engaging with individuals, I suppose each individual will have their own set of, both on the one hand set of skills and abilities, but then on the other hand set of things that may need to be addressed to accommodate them. It's sort of, I suppose, helpful to see the idea of inclusion and accommodation as something that embraces all types of disabilities, however, whatever form they might take.
Yes, please.
Yeah, to come back after what Anouk had said, I would agree that, of course, like looking for talent and diversity is the most important, and that job carving is really wonderful when it can happen, when you hire the person that fits what you're looking for and create a job that is adapted to him or her. However, most of the time we're still very far from that. And I think it's also important to look at the reality and to see what can be done in the state we're currently in. While job carving and asking organizations to hire people and then create a job for them is the ideal, there are a few companies, when a company wants to hire someone, they have a job in mind most of the time. And when we work with companies, they often have very clear concerns about hiring persons with disabilities. They're usually four main. They can be productivity, it can be the work environment, it can be the responsibility that they have for the person if they have a health issue, or it can be a fear of the unknown. And that's thing we can work on. And we can work with the company to understand better and to be open to hiring persons with disabilities for the specific job they have in mind. Of course, then we can also try to convince them to do job carving, and also job carving is relevant outside of person with disability. So job carving is a very nice idea, and I fully support it, but it's often asking too much at this stage. It's the ambition, but also in everyday work, when we want to promote the employment of persons with disabilities, we also have to work with the individual, with the employers, with also the employment services, in Belgium, VDAB or things like that. And it can be a tougher sell. Also, I would like to say, like, with the focusing on the talents, indeed, one of the issue is also that for young people that, for example, have gone through special education their whole childhood, it can be very difficult for themselves or for the family to see themselves what is their talent or what is their dream. And so there's a lot of work also on self-confidence and on the individual himself being confident enough to look for a job outside of what he has been told his whole life of segregation and things like that. So it's also, I think, a lot of work to be done with the family and with the individual, and simply preparing. When we talk with services, a lot simply preparing them to the open labor market. So there, it's not necessarily looking at their talent, it's also supporting and empowering them and their ambition. They can find their talent, or also simply, find a job. They don't have to be where they are amazing at it. We don't have to say, find the thing you're great at or your dream job, because we all have a dream job. For example, we have a very good example that someone had a dream job of being an airplane pilot. Very good to have a dream job. It was physically impossible, but then some people would say, no, you can't, you physically can't. But then it's more working on, okay, how can we achieve this? And on building the confidence and giving him the tools and working with employers to see what steps can go. And so, for example, that person in the end was placed in an airplane company, but not as a pilot. But we worked with him throughout to move forward in building his confidence and what he wanted to do. So looking too much at talents can be, again, for those maybe privileged persons with disabilities that have received an inclusive education and that have developed self-confidence enough and that have a clear plan. I think there's also a lot of individuals that need more basic support.
Yes, thank you so much, Tim. There are also some comments in the chat box. So, for instance, talking about that education establishments, especially in Flanders in Belgium, are currently very stuck in the past medical model, and the civil society organizations such as Contact and Breakout are pioneers today. And I think it's also relevant in the sense that you also, I think all of you mentioned the importance that also education plays, right? It's not only as education in a lot of the times is going to result in employment, so to also look at the broader perspective. Okay, I would like to ask you something, perhaps. In this, not necessarily in this project, but when analyzing the instruments, right, the legal and the policy instruments at the EU level, and I think it was very interesting how you explained it all, the instruments and also the limitations of, for instance, reasonable accommodation and so on. I would like to ask your opinions on this topic, on if you think that, for instance, affirmative actions could be a way to increase the employment of people with intellectual disabilities in the open labor market. And also perhaps add one comment that I think you all also made, that especially when you think about diversity management, it's a quite broad group of people that we're talking about, right? So there is also people with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes they are kind of like in the end of the queue when it comes to even when you think about diversity management. So, for instance, if affirmative actions would be enough in a broader way, or if perhaps we should have affirmative actions that are more specific to people with intellectual disabilities.
Perhaps shall I start? Yeah, I mean, I think so, I mean, if we look at EU anti-discrimination law, it's generally been premised on the basis that, you know, if we can remove prejudice and barriers, then people can compete for themselves, and all we need to do is to provide people with an equal opportunity. And I mean, that idea has a number of shortcomings, but particularly I think when you look at a group such as people with intellectual disabilities who are starting from a position of huge exclusion from the labour market, where very few people are working in the open labour market, it's clear that you have to go beyond simply trying to, you know, create a level playing field. Affirmative action is a broad umbrella and can encompass a lot of different things, but certainly I think that this is an area where, you know, there needs to be some kind of preferential treatment to try and break through, you know, very entrenched barriers. And I think as Tim was indicating, you know, I mean, few people are going to simply find jobs by themselves through applying for vacancies that are open, because entering into an open competition, you know, they're often going to not be selected. So it's kind of working with employers to create those openings, to kind of break down the stereotypes that might already exist, and affirmative action might have a role to play there. I mean, I think that's and I think that's also where we have to go beyond. Like, often there are measures in member states that set targets or quotas for hiring people with disabilities in general, but it's also, I think this is an area where it reminds us that, you know, amongst the category of people with disabilities, that there is a large variety of diversity, and that this is a group that, even compared to other people with disabilities, is highly underrepresented. So when we think about targeted measures, I think we also have to, in a sense, go beyond just general categories of disability. So yeah, I think there's a role for affirmative action.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I may, Barbara.
Yes.
I completely agree with the professor. I just can say that there's an example of a quota and for people with intellectual disabilities in Spain. So they are specifying that public services, public services need to hire X or Y number of people with intellectual disability. This is working, not enough, but it is working. They are doing it, and yeah, if we just have quota for all people with disabilities, every disability together, they will stay last in line. That's for sure, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Anouk. Tim, would you like to?
Yes, I agree overall. It's, again, for me, the difference between an ideal world and the reality. In an ideal world, we shouldn't have positive action. It should be by legislation, and companies will voluntarily do it. However, we see that doesn't happen. We also see that quota don't really work either. There's not yet a perfect solution, but there is some affirmative action that are needed. And indeed, for example, if we take again the example of Spain, there are also clear examples that when there's quotas without specifically person with disability, intellectual disabilities, companies will hire someone with a sort of disability card, but that has no impact on their work, the specific work. So, for example, someone that was doing a physical job, so we receive a disability certificate because he can't do that specific job, will be hired as a desk officer, where he is not at all impacted. And so they sort of cream the easier person with disabilities to place. And all those with severe disabilities, multiple disabilities, further away from the labor market, end up with not benefiting from these specific positive action. So affirmative actions are helping, but they need to be targeted and revised when they're not reaching the desired people.
Thank you so much for the speakers and for the participants, for your questions, your all the input. I think, oh yes, please, Tim.
There was just a question in the chat that didn't get to answer, is on a network of inclusive companies somewhere in Europe.
Oh, yes.
As far as I know, not specifically European, but there's a Global Business Disability Network. So it's global, not European, but under the patronage of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and they bring organizations like Carrefour, like L'Oréal, like a lot of big companies that are promoting employment of persons with disabilities, and they are sharing best practices among each other. So it's a good network to get in touch with.
Yes, exactly. I think also just to add to your answer, the diversity charters that you can access in the EU Commission website. I think each country has their specific diversity charter, and if you go to their websites, they usually have all the companies within the countries that sign to the diversity charter, so you can read more about what they are doing at their national levels. Okay, so I don't think we have any other questions. So I would like to thank you so much for your contributions. I do invite you to take a look at Inclusion Europe's website. There you can find all the outcomes that we have done. We have done videos about reasonable accommodation and customized employment, all the materials, guides for employers. So I think we have a lot of material there that can be quite interesting and useful. I would like to thank the speakers today, and next week we're going to have the next event. It's going to be with our member organization Rytmus in Czechia, where they're going to be talking about their work on supported employment. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye.